There are about 70 different components, views, and widgets in our palette that we can use in designing our interface. Sometimes we might want to control that's not part of those pre-designed and predefined components. So in this project, I wanted a switch that was vertical and that had a little more of a visual appeal to me than just the normal switch that is in Android Studio. So what I did is I designed two images in Photoshop, one for the on position, one for the off position, and then wrote a custom class to use those as a component. And you'll see that in my palette under project, I have a vertical switch. And that vertical switch is the class that I wrote. And in fact, I could just drag the vertical switch over and get a new instance of it. That custom component also allows me to specify attributes. So I'm just going to click this one, and you'll see there's an attribute here, a bit value. So that's the number you see showing up here as far as 128, 64, 32. I was able to specify that within the resources of my project and add that into the component. So there's code built into these custom views, though, that also provide the values that are used for the binary number and the decimal equivalent. Let's take a look at how to do this. I began in Photoshop by creating the images that I wanted to use for my switch, and I did that in layers in Photoshop. So I gave a little extra room at the bottom, which is where the bit value is going to be displayed. But here are the layers that comprise the on switch image. And then I can modify these layers and show you the off image. Now you notice this checkerboard, I made it transparent, so if I put this on a colored background, you wouldn't get this white area. It'd be whatever color is around that. If you want to see this a little better, I can turn on the white background so you can see this is what it's going to look like on a white background. I saved those both out as PNG files, and then in my project, I imported those into my drawable folder, and I named these vertical switch off X and vertical switch on X. You see I have an off and an on as well. These were two different variations. The X at the end was my version that added a little more space at the bottom of my view so that I had a place to put the bit value that I wanted to use. And that bit value is simply drawn in as text in my class. And we'll see that here in a minute. I also went into the values and added in our ATTRS XML file some code to declare the different attributes that I wanted to use. So I'm calling my control a vertical switch. That's going to be the name of my class. And then some referencing a declare-styleable of that name. And then I'm setting up an attribute called bit value that's going to be an integer. And here is one named position state that's going to be an enum of either off or on. And if we go back to our layout, you'll see there's a bit value and a position state that's added into the attributes, and here is off and on. Now I ended up not using the position state. Instead, I'm using a class level variable. But that's how you can add in attributes for your custom view. Next, I created a new class called a vertical switch. In my class for vertical switch, I built a constructor that is extending the app-compat image view, and which is being passed some parameters of context, the attributes, and the defined style attribute. We have to create three constructors normally, but when I created the class vertical switch, extending that, it gave me an option of adding in this @JVM overloads constructor, which allows me to write one constructor that handles all three situations. By default, each constructor is handling different parameters. So Android Studio will create this portion of the constructor for you if you just reference the class and extending a view. Now, I can also extend just a normal view. I knew I wanted to have an image in here, so I just extended the image view. I then have some variables, class level variables, position being an integer, and 0 is off, 1 is on. I ended up using this instead of that position state. The bit value, which is going to be 1, 2, 4, 8, 6, 16, and so forth, I set that to 0 initially. And then I created some defaults. The bit value by default would be 1, and the position would be 0, and we'll see how we use that in a minute. And then a Boolean expression of on-off is the state on or off, that position on or off. I ended up not using the custom attribute, so I could actually get rid of that. And then I have a reference to my two bitmaps, that switch off X and switch on X. And I simply called it img off and img on. An initialization then, that if the attributes is not null, we're going to set A to the context of the obtained styled attributes. That's getting those attributes from that attrs XML file, and the style I'm applying is that we created for the vertical switch. So in that we have our bit val, and I'm going to get the attribute for bit value that I created. And if one doesn't exist or hasn't been set, we'll use the default bit value, which would be 1. I had a little log in here where I was doing some troubleshooting. Really don't need that anymore. I can get rid of that. And then the position, I'm also getting the position state and setting the default position to 0. Now again, I ended up not using that anywhere in my program, but I really wanted to demonstrate how you can use an enum for your attributes. I created a function called getDecValue, which is going to take the position, that's either 1 or 0, times the bit value, which in my case is going to be 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, or 128. So that far left switch, if it's on, is going to be 1 times 128. And so my dec value would be 128. If it's off, position is going to be 0. So 0 times 128 would give me 0. Same with the binary digit. I wanted to take the position and convert that to a string, whether it be a 1 or a 0. So the code that I'm using to calculate the binary and the decimal equivalent for those 8 switches combined in this project is coming from the control itself, or from the view itself. Now you want to have a on-sized changed, which will redraw the screen, and then we need an onDraw function. So here in the onDraw function, I added a bunch of code which is drawing the text at the bottom of my image that shows the bit value. If I didn't want to do that, all it would simply be would be super.onDraw and passing it the canvas. I want to make sure that I'm changing the isClickable to true so we can accept a button click. Might as well do that when we draw the item, the canvas. I also need to overwrite and validate, and just passing and validate forward. What that does, it forces the image to be redrawn with any change. And then here is my code for the click. So overriding the perform click, it's going to return a Boolean of either true or false. And then every time I click that switch, I wanted to change it to the opposite. So I have on off equals not on off. So if it's on, it's going to become off. If it's off, it'll become on. And then the position is going to equal that value. If it's true, it's going to be a 1. And if it's false, it would be a 0. And then if on off is true, I want to show the on image. And if it's false, I want to show the off image. And then I pass that invalidate call to force it to redraw. And then return the super.perform click. That's my code. Now let's take a look at the interface again. I'm going to focus on the landscape because it's easier to see. So I simply created a new vertical switch, and I actually did this originally in code, and then I copied and pasted. And all I did here is change the names on each of these and change the bit value attribute, and then set these up in a horizontal chain. Added in some text views, a few more text views for the labels here, and then also for what's the binary value and the decimal equivalent value. So in each of these I named VS for vertical switch 128, VS64, VS32, and so forth. And then my code for main activity,
was I simply created references to each of those items and to the two text views that I wanted to change. In my onCreate, I'm creating a create view references function call, where all I did is I referenced the IDs of those. Rather than doing it here in the onCreate, I did it as a separate method. Add the code to hide my action bar at the top. And then the only other code here is the switch set, which is being called by the onClick attribute for each of these vertical switches. And that was inherited from the image view that I extended. So all 8 of these switches call that same onClick event of switch set, so that anytime any of these are clicked and changed, it's going to recalculate the binary number and the decimal equivalent. Let's go back to that code. So I have my switches put in a list, and again, I'm just referencing those variables that were created in the create view references. I'm setting my binary string to null, my decimal equivalent to 0. So I'm going through each one of those switches and getting its binary digit value and its decimal value that were built in to the class of VerticalSwitch. So the binary string is simply adding a 0 or a 1, and the decimal equivalent is simply adding up the decimal value of that switch, whether it be 0 or 128 or 0 and 64 or 0 and 32 and so forth. Then all I do is I set those two text views to the binary string and the decimal equivalent and converting that to a string, because that is an integer. That is how this all works.
So here once again is the project running. I can click on any one of these switches, click the 32 switch. You'll see I get a 1 now for the binary digit in that location, and total is 32. I can add 4, I can add 128, and so forth. And of course I can turn these on and off. And each time I click, it's going to recalculate. And again, it's all built into the VerticalSwitch as far as those calculations. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the Android App Development Cohort playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos that I create, you can click my picture up in the top right and subscribe to the channel.